One of the biggest questions we tend to get in our comment section is about the pivot and how we use said pivot in the golf swing to create both speed and precision. So what we're going to take a look at in this video is what is a pivot, how do we use it, and how can we better harness this movement during the golf swing to help you play some of the best golf of your life. So when it comes to a pivot, I think a lot of us tend to kind of subscribe to the Mr. Mike Adams viewpoint of a pivot. And Mr. Adams was able to identify that certain players pivoted more through their lead leg, certain players pivoted more through their trail leg, and certain players just kind of pivoted through the middle. So what Mr. Adams was kind of looking at was different pivot styles, or how the body is moving throughout the golf swing, and how much does the body move during the backswing before we start seeing the body try to twist. And when I think of the pivot, I tend to think of Mr. James Lights' analogy of the grapes. And if we remember that video that we did earlier in our series on how we manage the grapes, what Mr. Lights told us was we kind of have this lower point, and we could really use our center of mass or the middle of our pelvis for this. But we have this lower point here, this lower grape, and then we have an upper grape. And when we think about a pivot, what we kind of want to think about is we want to think about these grapes kind of moving in a kind of uniform effort or in unison. So we want to kind of get these grapes moving a little bit back and forth in this frontal plane, but we want to get these moving together. And one of the common things we see when people talk about a pivot, and I agree with a lot of people when they talk about this, is they talk about how the upper grape tends to get going way ahead of the lower grape. And that's definitely not what we want to typically see within a pivot. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about how we create this uniform movement of the upper and lower grape, to borrow from James Lights, and we're going to talk about how we're going to use that uniform movement to get to a place where we can actually create the pivot and the twist and the torque in the golf swing. So make sure you stay tuned, because now that we have a better understanding of what we're talking about, now we're going to dig in on how to make this better for you. So now we're going to take a little deeper dive into how these grapes kind of move and how this pivot all kind of comes together. So when we think of the grapes, generally speaking, what we're talking about is either end of the spine. And what we want to do is we want to create a movement with that spine to where the spine is able to move initially a little side to side without creating a whole lot of side bend. And that's what we want to try to stay away from, because once again, we want to get these grapes moving a little more uniform this way and a little less like this. So what we've got to kind of manage here is we've got to manage these grapes and how they move and how much they move. And one thing that we tend to see with people who have a difficult time getting their body to rotate and pivot is that they really tend to struggle with sliding the lower body too far to the right. And I think a lot of people are doing this because we understand inherently that we need to move to the right to create a load in the golf swing. But where golfers really struggle is that they've also been told to not move their head. And that is kind of a way to anchor this upper grape if we think about it. So if I know I'm supposed to move to the right a little bit with my grapes, but I'm also told to keep my head still, that tends to create a lot of this here. And that's where we start seeing that that right hip is moving outside of the right knee and the right ankle. And now it's going to be very hard for that to bear weight because structurally it's become unsound. So that's not really helping us create a pivot to where we're going to be able to plant and then twist, because that's making me very structurally unsound and actually getting my upper grape and my upper body to move back towards the target. And now this is going to be very difficult for me to get the club to create any depth at all. It's going to create a whole lot of lift, which we can see from down the line. And it's very difficult for me to get that club to want to go around and on the quote unquote swing plane. So what we want to do here is we want to start kind of thinking about this in a little bit different terms. So when we talk about sways are typically considered to be very bad, but we do need some sway. And I think that that's one thing that doesn't get said enough, is a little bit of this moving of the grapes side to side in the golf swing, especially in the downswing, is actually a pretty good thing. Now, when we talk about how much, that's where it gets to be very interesting, because what we feel tends to be very excessive relative to what's actually happening. So when we think about how much we actually move our center, I'm going to try to line myself up here the best I can with kind of this little ruler we set up here for you guys to see. But I'm not using anybody's numbers. I'm not using Sportsbox or any of the other numbers that have been provided for averages and movement. I'm just kind of keeping it very, very simple here. So this is just for our conversation. But I've basically got my center here, which is where my center of mass is starting and where my lower grape and upper grape are starting. And then I've marked 4 inches on either side of that middle. And the reason that I've marked 4 inches is because I know that that's really about how much we're going to be actually moving the grapes side to side. And if I kind of feel like I orientate my grapes from one piece of tape to the other, that's really not a lot of movement. And from the camera there, you can see that I'm really not bumping my hips side to side or creating any of that unnecessary side bend with the spine or the grapes. I'm simply just moving kind of within the structure. So the way I tend to think of this a little bit is I've got a right hip over here, I've got a left hip over here, and I've got a spine in the middle. And that spine is allowed to move in between the 2 hips. So there's going to be a little bit of sway in there. And like we said, sway is not always a bad thing, and creating a little bit of that bump in both directions is definitely going to be a good thing when it comes to managing our pivot. So once again, the pivot is the upper and lower grape moving horizontally side to side during the backswing and downswing. And that's where we're kind of defining this pivot and understanding that it's not moving outside the structure of the legs and the body, rather it's moving inside that structure. And even though we talk about moving 4 to 8 inches, whatever that amount is, one thing that we have to understand is when we actually look at this in reality, we're not moving very much. It's not this big sway side to side, and that's how we go about starting to manage our grapes. Being the force plate guy, things always lead back to the ground for me. And one of the biggest reasons that we need some of this sway and some of this pivot is because what we need to be able to do in the golf swing is we need to be able to transfer our pressure into our trail side. So when we talk about transferring our pressure into our trail side, we're gonna have to pick up that left foot and apply a little pressure onto our trail foot. That's kind of how that works. So you can see I'm not really moving very much to the right. Once again, it's just a little bit of that sway, but we can see my lower grape and my upper grape are both wanting to move together. Now, where a lot of golfers really run into issues with this is that they tend, like we said, to try to keep their head still, but they know that they got to move to the right, and this is what tends to happen to a lot of those golfers. And we start seeing a lot of this happening, and now we can see that that upper grape is moving back towards the target. Now, if I start moving mass back towards the target, it's going to become much more difficult for me to create any load underneath my trail foot. And now all of a sudden it's become incredibly difficult for me to transfer that pressure into that trail side and to load the trail spiral line, which as we know is very, very important when it comes to creating power and precision within the golf swing. So this pivot is very, very important because not only is it allowing us to create some room in the backswing to accelerate the golf club, but it's also allowing for the golfer to go ahead and start being able to create that pressure underneath the right leg, the stability in the trail side, it's loaded, and now I can take my upper grape and my lower grape, and instead of just moving them in the horizontal plane and getting this way and out over my skis, now I can actually create that twist and get my upper body to start actually loading as well, and not just my lower body. So stick around, because what we're gonna take a look at next is now that we've finally got that lower body loaded and we got our pivot under control, now we're gonna add the torque and take full advantage of a 3-dimensional pivot instead of just a 1-dimensional slide. So one of my favorite things to help people do is to regain their mobility and regain their speed, because I hear from a lot of people that they've lost both those things. And a lot of people equate it to age and think that because they've gotten a little bit older, they've lost the ability to twist and to move. And in reality, they've just lost their pivot. And if we can give them their pivot back, now all of a sudden they can twist and move again and feel like they're 30 to 40 years younger and hopefully gain 30 to 40 yards of ball flight. So, long story short, how do we get them to move in those 3 dimensions? We talked about the frontal plane, and we talked about this horizontal movement away and towards from the target, but now we're going to talk about how the spine moves away and towards from the ball. That creates some really nice sagittal plane torque, and then we're also going to talk about some of this transverse plane. But the nice thing is that you've already done most of this work. By getting the pivot and the grapes more managed in the first part, now we're going to be able to take advantage of this newfound mobility. So let's look at how this works. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get set up. And like we said, we're not trying to move a lot. We're just trying to kind of get those grapes moving to the right. And the way I like to think about this is I'm just moving my grapes more on top of my right leg. I'm just moving my grapes more on top of my right leg. It's just a very subtle little shift. So I've got my grapes on my right leg, and now because my weight's over here on my right side, it's very easy for me just to let the club move to the right. So as we can see here, the club head hasn't really gotten above my hands. So I'm nice and wide, and I'm just letting my upper body go ahead and stretch on top of my loaded right leg. And now here's the beautiful thing, because we've allowed for this lat to actually expand, and I haven't kept my head to the left because I'm not trying to keep my head still, now what I'm able to do is I'm able to very easily twist the club up to the top of my swing. It's a lot easier for me to do because my right leg is loaded, all the weight's on my right side right now, and this becomes much easier to create this 3-dimensional twist and torque that allows for us to take advantage of the full range of motion of our pivot, because a pivot isn't simply 1-dimensional, it's 3-dimensional, just like human beings move. So by being able to go ahead and get the grapes on top of the right leg, now it's much easier to twist everything as a singular unit and create that 3-dimensional stretch, 3-dimensional twist, which creates more length and a longer moment arm. So now that we've taken a deeper dive into this pivot idea, and we've kind of maybe even gotten lost a little bit in the weeds talking about how we have to move in not only the frontal, but the transverse and the sagittal plane, I hope that better helps us understand that it doesn't have to be so complicated. Now, once we get the grapes moving apart from one another, then the pivot does tend to get very complicated, and we need some counter moves and things like that, which tend to make it very, very messy. And as we know, we only have 1 second to make this swing. So the more counters and countermeasures that I have to make during the swing to line things up, the more that's going to be difficult to play consistently at a high level. So by helping you better understand this pivot, we hope it helps simplify some of the things that have maybe been misleading before and allows you to play some of the best golf of your life. So let us know how it goes. Let us know what you think in the comment section. And if you haven't already, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, because that certainly helps a ton. So thanks so much, and until next time, keep grinding.